Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to continue with a theme we started in last week's online seminar, in which 3 experts discussed the big picture around due diligence laws. But this time, we're going deeper and more specific by looking at the forthcoming German Act on corporate due diligence obligations in supply chains, which aims to prevent human rights violations. Stage 1 will come into force in January 2023, so a little over a year, and with a broader scope scheduled for the following year, January 2024. And we'll be hearing more about that from experts. So we've got 3 speakers today. One will give you an overview of the new law. You don't need to listen to me about that. You can actually hear an expert talk about it. We have another speaker who will talk about the law from the perspective of a large German retailer. And we have a third speaker who will present a new GIZ project, which has high hopes of bringing buyers and producers together to develop models of shared responsibility around the new law. I'm going to turn over in a moment to Lisa Rammershoven for some brief introductory remarks. But before I do that, let me invite you all to turn on your cameras if you would like to. If you don't, then by all means don't. But if you would like to, please do so. In the top right-hand corner of the WebEx platform, you will see a button, a layout button. We suggest you to set your layout to stack or side by side. And we just suggest that because then our speakers won't feel so lonely talking into what can sometimes be a cold void of the digital seminar room. And it can be quite disconcerting sitting here talking into your laptop camera, not knowing whether there's anybody else out there. My name is Stephen Frost and I'm your host today. I'll be back with our panelists in a moment and some more general information on the WebEx platform, such as how to ask questions and so on. But before that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Rammershoven, a Junior Advisor for Sustainability in Textile Supply Chains for GIZ, coming to us from Cambodia. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Stephen. Welcome again to all of you to our second online seminar. Thanks so much for turning on your cameras. It's nice to see, we can see a few familiar faces and names, both from, working together regularly, but also from last week's online seminar. As most of you know, GIZ FABRIC is dedicated to promoting sustainability in the garment and textile sector, which is a goal that we share with many of the participants here today. A crucial part in addressing the challenges for our sector is working together and finding approaches through knowledge sharing and regional exchange. Working together across stakeholder groups and across borders is a key element of this online series. While FABRIC is working in 6 countries in Asia, many of the audience here today produce for consumers from Germany, France, Norway, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, the UK, or the US. And what all of those countries have in common is that they have passed due diligence laws. Regardless if you are a producer that has clients from those countries, or if you're a brand representative from these countries, or if you're working with any other supply chain stakeholder, that means that you are or will be affected by those laws. Last week, we took a broader approach and it became very clear that proactively engaging and approaching this law and preparing for them is essential. Today, we want to take the first step in that direction, and that's why we specifically chose the German due diligence law. We will start with some inputs from our speakers, and then I invite you to be part of the conversation and part of today's regional exchange. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and Stephen and I will do our best to hand them over to the panelists and get as many of them answered as possible. So on that note, let me hand over to Stephen and then to our speakers. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Thank you, Lisa. Before I turn to our panel, let me deal with a few housekeeping issues. First of all, this event is being recorded and the recording will be made available. You'll be sent an email with a link in about a week or so. So you can share that with your network, etc. Second, you are all in listen-only mode. We invite you to turn on your cameras if you like, but there's no open mic. If you want to ask questions, then you should type them into the comment box. You can type questions in at any time, and I'll try to get them through. I'll try to get through them either during the discussion or later on in the Q&A session. So I think a question kind of feeds into the discussion. I'll ask. Otherwise, I'll come back to it at Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Just a note on asking questions. If your question is directed to a specific speaker, please indicate to whom you are addressing the question so I can throw it to that person specifically. The third thing, we will have a short survey at the end of this event. There will be a link towards the end of the event in the chat box as we start concluding. This is to help us improve what we could do better, etc. So if you could take the time to click on that link and just take a short survey. It's very short, it doesn't take you long, and it helps us make these events more relevant and informative. Now, finally, I mentioned, and so Lisa mentioned this, that this is the second seminar of the same theme of laws and supply chains. So last week we had an event, big picture. This week we're drilling down into the German law, but next week we're going even further down into law and supply chains with an event on the 1st of December, which continues with this theme, be specifically on the international accord. But it's a little bit different. And it's different because we are soliciting questions beforehand for the panel to answer. So I'm going to put an email in the chat box. And if you are, particularly if you're a producer in the STAR network, if you're a textile garment producer in Asia and you want to know more about the international accord, if you've ever wanted to ask a question but were too afraid to do so, or you really want to know something, next week is your opportunity to have that question answered. We would like questions in by this week, so we can distribute them to the panelists for next week. They have some time to chew over them, and so next week we will begin by dealing with some of the questions that you have sent in. Now, we will not name you in the questions. We will not ask the question in your name. It'll be completely anonymous. So this is your opportunity. I'll come back to this at the end, but this is just a little heads up. asiandialogues@giz.de. And I'll remind you at the end about this. Okay, now over to our panelists. I'm going to turn first of all to Mr. Frank Hurft, Global Scheme Manager, Secure Supply Chain Certification, Project Manager, Supply Chain Audit Services at TÜV Rheinland, a company with whom all of you, I'm sure, are familiar. Frank has been with TÜV Rheinland for over 21 years in the area of auditing sustainability topics, mainly in Germany and Europe. And he has developed a gap analysis for supply chain due diligence to help companies manage the new German Due Diligence Act. What I'm saying to you is he's an expert on this. He's been spending a lot of time looking at the German Due Diligence Act and how it's going to play out for all parties in the supply chain. So, Frank, I know you've been working really hard at TÜV Rheinland, figuring out what the new Due Diligence Act actually specifically requires. So could you just start us off with an overview of what's in it, what's it all about, etc.?
Hello and good day to all of you. Thank you, Stephen, for the question. And I would like to answer it to you. I've prepared a short presentation which will, of course, be made available for you, of course. George, can you please send me the release button for the presentation so that I can... Oh, fine. Thank you. So... So I hope everybody can see the presentation. Is it okay? Maybe can... Okay, fine. Thank you. First of all, I would like to give you a short brief for which group of addresses the law is relevant. In the first phase, from the 1st of January 2023, it affects German companies with more than 3,000 employees. In the second phase, from January 2024, German companies with more than 1,000 employees will also be affected. This means that companies that have companies as customer must assume that they must implement the requirements of this law. The focus is on compliance with the human rights and the environmental requirements of the law. The German companies must prove the authorities that they comply with the legal requirements in their company for the entry supply chain, from development, from procurement of raw materials, productions and logistics. This applies equally the products and services which were used. A distinction is made between direct suppliers and indirect suppliers, such as distributors and agencies. What does the law essentially requires for the German contractors? Basically, these are the following 7 points. At first, the creation of a policy statement and appointment of human rights representatives. In addition, the law also requires the establishment of a risk management system that incorporates the requirement human and environmental rights. A risk analysis of the suppliers must be carried out annually and, if necessary, taken into account the country-specific requirements at the production site. In addition, preventive measures and corrective actions for identified deviations must be defined. In addition of that, a compliant procedure must be installed to enable people working in the supply chain to complain the client about conditions that do not meet the requirements. It is important to know that the complaint does not have to come from the individual employee. It also can come from associations. Ultimately, the German company must evaluate the effectiveness of the measures from the risk analysis and document this in an annual report that goes to the German Ministry and here especially to the BAFA. All these aspects you can find in this graphic. You can find information about the company. You can find information about the aspects you have to implement. On the one hand, the human rights commissioner, you have to implement a transparency report. You will also have to do this for your subsidiaries, and you have to make sure that you will implement the risk management. I think the structure of risk management is, from the method and the system, very well known from every one of you. And I would just like to remind you once again that the country-specific human rights and environmental requirements, as well as the requirements specific in the law, must be considered. This is very important. So you will find all these symbols and the documentation in the presentation we will send to you. At the end of the day, we have to ask us, how can a German company check whether the implementation of country-specific requirements is fulfilled? The legislature has commented on this as follows. We can read it here in the blue box. The verification of compliance with the company's own human rights related standard with direct suppliers can be carried out, for example, through the company's own site inspections, through third parties commissioned to carry out these audits, and through the use of recognized certification systems or audit schemes. This means maybe if you have implemented some of these systems, you're on the right way. But at the end of the day, we cannot say if this is enough, because not all the aspects of the human rights and also the aspects of the environmental aspects will be implemented in these standards. So we have to wait for the correct information from the law, which and it will be necessary in the future. I'm sorry. So let us talk about the terms and definitions and the aspects of the human rights will be implemented in your organization. I've listed the relevant aspects here in this form on the right side. We have 10 requirements concerning the human rights, which should already be familiar for you. These are in detail prohibition of child labor, prohibition of forced labor, prohibition of slavery, and so on and so on. You can read it. I think this is not so extremely, you will all know these aspects. On the other hand, we have the aspects of the environmental law, and we have here 5 aspects which you can see on the side. So here I have a short presentation for you of the human rights which we had in the past, and we have noticed during audits in India. First of all, we have the topics of the human rights, and I think everybody of you will find maybe some aspects in his own companies. For you, it's very important to say, okay, we will work on these aspects and we will make sure that we have corrective actions for these aspects. On the one hand, on the human rights, and on the other hand, we have these aspects in the environmental requirements. Of course, these aspects are only examples, and I hope I've been able to give you a brief overview of the new supply chain law and the resulting requirements for the suppliers. So from my side, back to Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. You started off by saying this is for all German companies. Can you just expand a bit on what does German company mean in the context of the law? What is a German company?
A German company is a company which is located in Germany and which is paying the taxes in Germany. This is a German company. And The German company is also a subsidiary if they, yeah, I can say this is the right thing if this company is paying taxes in Germany.
Right. So if you're a US retailer with a shop with shops in Germany, you're a German company paying paying tax. Yeah. Okay.
And also there are subsidiaries all over the world.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So if you have a procurement company or organization, it's also a subsidiary from the German company, so it's also included.
Yes, right. So one of the key things here is the establishment of a risk management system and the definition of in-house responsibility. I noticed on your PowerPoint has gone now, so I'm going from memory here. But indirect suppliers, these first couple of things under the due diligence requirements may or may not be applicable. Is that correct?
So you have both situations. On the one hand, you have the direct suppliers and the indirect suppliers. You also have to know which indirect suppliers are implemented in your supply chain. Otherwise, you have no chance to get information what will be wrong in their supply chain and what will happen in their organization and in the plans. So it must be very important. It is very important for you to be informed about all these indirect suppliers which you have in your supply chain. Otherwise, you have no chance to do any corrective actions. It's very, very difficult. And you have to implement then these companies, these suppliers in your risk management system. So it will be very difficult to get all these informations from the agencies and from the distributors, which will be used from you. And I think it will be very difficult to get this information from those agencies and distributors who is in their supply chain. Will be one of the big problems in the future.
Stephanie Maurice has asked, Frank, can you please share more about required transparency reporting for direct and indirect suppliers? Will these be made publicly available? Is there a template for companies to follow for these reports?
Currently, I'm not able to give you any information about that. You have the chance to get reports from organizations, for example, like BSCI or SMETA. They have databases in which those companies share documents, and you can read in these databases what will happen in these companies. But you have to be a member of this, and otherwise you have no chance to get information about that. For example, BSCI is an organization which is very relevant, or also SEDEX with the SMETA documents. And very important is for you to know you have to be a member of that organizations, otherwise you have no chance to get information.
Right, okay. Thanks for that question, Stephanie. Can you talk a little bit about what you think this is going to mean for producers, manufacturers in Asia? What's new here? What are the things that they should be thinking about now?
It's new. New is the situation that in the past you have the situation that the buyers normally do not check the situation in the plans. Maybe they have a code of conduct, or they have documents which you complete online, or was so that nobody will come to the plant and will check these effectiveness of the requirements in the plan, focused on the aspects of the human rights and their environmental rights. That will be more than in the past. You will have audits in the plants, they will be on site, and they will check, they have to check the implementation of these aspects in the plants. That will be totally different than in the past. It will be not for you enough to make a documentation that you have implemented these aspects. You have to show that they are working, and this is a totally different situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I want to just stress that a little bit for all four people on this call. One of the major differences here is going to be the requirement to show, to demonstrate, to prove. This is something that came up last week as well, and I'm glad you've mentioned this again. This does take it up a level for producers in the region, that you are going to have to be able to demonstrate. You are going to have to be able to show these things, which for many is something that they're not doing now. Some, of course, are. I think there are many out there that this will be a tough one. So any of the attendees, if you've got questions for Frank, if you want to follow up on anything with that, put it into the chat box. I'm going to move on to Ms. Julia Thim now, but we can come back to Frank in Q&A if you've got questions. So get busy typing if you want to know something. So let's go to Julia now. Julia is the head of human rights at Chibo, and with her team in Hamburg and also in Hong Kong and in Dhaka in Bangladesh, she is responsible for implementing human rights in the global supply chain for Chibo. In the last 10 years, she's had a particular focus on empowerment and industry-wide approaches, and was involved in setting up the Bangladesh Accord and Act on Living Wages. Until 2011, she was a campaigner at the Clean Clothes campaign in Germany. Julia, one of the things I saw in over the last year in the media in Germany was that Chibo came out early and strongly in support of the new German law, when there was still some debate within Germany over the content of the law, and debate even over whether such a law should even be passed, let alone considered. So can you start off by telling us why Chibo thought this law was necessary? Why did the company come out in such strong and vocal and public support of this?
First of all, hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much. And I'm actually very much looking forward to this event, because I've been speaking on the law quite a lot within Germany, but it's the first event that reaches out to you all in Asia, which I find personally also very interesting. So I'm looking forward to your questions. So why did Chibo come out on the law? I think what's important to know as a background is that Chibo started its sustainability or CSR work about 15 years ago, because we were targeted back then by the Clean Clothes campaign about bad working conditions in supplying factories in Bangladesh. So Chibo felt the public, consumer, and civil society pressure all along. And being a family-owned business, that was the moment that we decided to also go beyond our own operations, where the family has always felt responsible for its employees, to also look at what's happening in the supply chain and how the employee situation is there. So we have had implementation experience, and that's also what we decided to bring into the debate, because we wanted to make sure that it's not just a theoretical discussion, but we felt that we had insights into implementing and from practices on the ground that would be worth sharing. And for us, what we noticed there are two main reasons basically that we noticed in implementation, that violating human rights and environmental standards could be, before the law, could have been a competitive advantage. There is sometimes a conflict between business goals and complying with human rights. And we felt that this conflict shouldn't exist, that there should be a minimum threshold to make sure that businesses work in compliance with human rights and environmental standards, and that this shouldn't be a question of business or money. So that's why we came out to speak for a due diligence law, because we see that this minimum threshold is now established because it applies for companies operating in Germany. And we do see similar trends in Europe, which we also welcome. Here it goes a little bit, the broader the better, so they are not competitive loopholes across the globe for companies to take. The second reason is that while implementing it, we'd also realized that there are problems and challenges that we can't solve as a single company. There are problems that are inherent in the whole industry, then in particular industries and countries that are systemic. And that's also one of the reasons why Chibo has quite long ago already moved away from only performing audits to doing our own dialogue program, but also being active in industry-wide initiatives. You already heard that we were involved in setting up the Accord and Act on Living Wages, which are our most important industry-wide initiatives. And we there felt that it needs the more the better. And we were basically also trying to get other brands on board. And that was also, I think, a moment where the CEO said, is that my role in trying to convince other companies to join these? So we do feel that the law giving the minimum threshold will also make it possible to really change industries. And while I know this is a GIZ FABRIC event, a little bit of as a background, we are not just a fashion retailer. Well, actually the biggest coffee seller in Germany, and we sell a lot of other non-food items. And while we see industry-wide initiatives in the fashion industry, we are quite far away from that in some of the other industries that we are active in. So we also felt that a law would promote these because everyone would be coming along on this. So that are the two main reasons for Chibo.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just Aaron Goldman has got a question here. This is Frank I'd be interested to hear what Frank has to say about this as well. And Aaron's saying, isn't this just going to push the onus of responsibility back to suppliers?
And this was actually a risk that has also been discussed within Germany why the law was written. And there's quite an explicit statement that terminating a business relationship should only be the last resort. And that also the German company needs to show that it has implemented preventive and remediative measures. So I do understand that risk, and I think in a way it exists. I do think that the law language is taking this into account. Frankly speaking, I also think when we look at the industries, and from my experience, we don't even assume that they are factories in compliance. We know that a factory is a place where humans come together, where human relations play a big part, and we know that there will be violations taking place. So for us as a company, it's really important to see the commitment from the factory to work on this together. And that is what the law also recognizes. It doesn't ask for everything to be in compliance. It asks for brands to take preventive and remediation measures, and for everyone involved to take the effort. And I think one switch that you might feel from the companies is that in the past, I think it depends on the companies, obviously, of how much they have already done in their supply chains. And there are some, not just us, some really big international retailers that I think have built up quite established programs already, and that have been working with their partners and with you in the supply chains. So there might even be some of you where not so much changes. I think one change will be that it does have this work all together has more weight within the company. So why it was voluntarily before, now we have the legal department involved, we have the compliance department involved. And the law actually also explicitly states that purchasing practices also need to be reviewed. So the law states very clearly that brands do have, or buyers do have, a responsibility of also changing and reviewing their own internal structures. And I think that's also important for you to know, because it's something that I recommend you to go into dialogue with your buyers. And I would even say that this might give you a bigger leverage to say, no, in my company, this is important. I care for my workers. I want to implement social and environmental standards. I'm doing a good job, and I'm, because of the law, expecting you to honor this. And so I think that's one of the things that, I wanted you to make aware of, that I would be hoping, and of course it depends on the implementation, but this is something that brands need to be report on, that they will need to look at their own operations.
Aaron's followed up as you were talking. I don't know if you can see his question, but yeah, he's asking the question that often gets asked. I've been hearing this for 20 years, 25 years. Who will pay for this? Who ultimately pays for this? There's a lot of investment required to make improvements at factory levels, and are we running the risk, or does the law run the risk of driving up costs that will drive out smaller players? He says potentially, perhaps not a bad idea, but tightening razor-thin margins, and then we're back to the point that you raised as you answered this question, which is about purchasing practices having to be a part and parcel of this whole process. Is there a potential for that? Is there a potential for improvement costs driving out smaller players? And who is going to pay for this?
Overall, I understand the concern, and I can say that also that concern is shared within my company. So it's not something that's, I think, just lies with the producers. I think that goes very much also with the retailers, with the buyers, and so on. I would hope that the law actually takes out some of the competition around that, like I said, because it does bring in a level playing field. I don't want to deny that there are costs, but also like I said, the reasoning why we were for the law was that we are hoping that in a way it goes across the industry, and that it's a shared model. And that's also in a way why we have been promoting industry-wide initiatives, because we see that these basically also provide for economies of scale, and they also prevent from double measures to be taken too much, because it's not, and I know that that's already a problem in factories about, some of the producers nearly having an audit every day. where you keep wondering, is that a way for everyone to spend money? And I do think that there is a risk in that, but I think that's also something, and I mean, Torsten Metz is also going to speak about the GIZ initiative, where it depends on how we work on this together. And I understand the concern and the risks, but I do feel that together we can also mitigate it in terms of coming out with shared initiatives where the responsibility is shared, like Act on Living Wages, where the brands have made a commitment to cover higher labor costs in case an industry-wide collective bargaining agreement is negotiated in a country.
Right.
So this is possible. And I think particularly in the fashion industry, there is a lot of interest on both sides to drive it this way. And I think the chances for this now are better than without the law.
Right.
Because it affects everyone.
Understood. Frank, did you want to jump in on, did you have anything to contribute to what you wanted to say to Aaron about these questions of pushing down on suppliers, of who's going to pay for this, etc.?
So this is a very difficult situation for us because we are just doing those audits, and the companies have to pay us for the audit. So it's for us very, very difficult. And we always have the situation that we are discussing about pricing, about the costs for the audit, and so on and so on. And not only the supplier discuss about the costs, we also have the problem. And so we have to find a solution how it maybe could work. One example is for us that we maybe could realize remote audits in the future. This could be something, a tool that we can use and that will reduce the prices for all the audit activities. Another aspect is that the branches use documents for a lot of suppliers, and they share the documents in the branches, and so that also reduces the costs. And on the other hand, we have to train and implement a lot of employees for these audits, and we will also have costs on this. Yeah, we also have costs, not only the suppliers, we also have costs to be able to conduct these audits on site in the companies. So it's difficult for all. And we have to find solutions. One maybe could be the solution, for example, that we realize remote audits, and we will find other solutions in the future to reduce the costs for all.
And I realized that I wasn't particular on the small companies. I'm actually I mean, it's a bit difficult. I mean, I would say Chibo is a medium-sized one on the international level for medium-sized to answer for small ones. But we have been working with small ones, both in our supply chains and also with some of our suppliers, or there have actually been quite a number of small companies also coming forward for the law, because they have said that it would make their life also easier because it's then applicable for everyone. So I don't actually think that I mean, it depends on how to do it. It's a concern for everyone, but for me, it's not so much. I haven't seen it necessarily experienced it so much as a big versus small. I feel that everyone is in that, and it can also make it easier for the smaller ones that everyone is involved.
Thanks, Julia. I've got a question here from Emily Caswell for you, Frank. Does the law imply any preference between in-house auditing processes versus third-party audits to illustrate due diligence?
No. If you have the competence and you can show the competence, you can also do it in-house. It's no problem. But it's very difficult to have the competence, for example, from Morocco and also from Vietnam and Bangladesh. So this is because we are doing our job. because we have located the auditors in those countries. It is very difficult to make sure that all your employees have the competence for the country-specific laws. Very difficult.
Thanks, Frank.
But it's
But
an
if
option.
if I look at,
It's no
you know, if we'll
it's no
actually
problem.
have factory employers here and factory owners,
Yeah.
if you are transparent about your own procedures, and if you are willing to share them with us as a buyer, for example, Chibo, we also don't, like, we have a dialogue program, and there it's important for us to work together. So we at a certain point don't always ask for audits. So I do think that there is room for you to be proactive on this and to show that you have procedures in place and that you have audit schemes and so on, so already, that I think will also be recognized. And there's no distinction within the law. It just says preventive and remedial measures that need to be shown to be effective. But what you do is, and that's on purpose. And I can also say, I know might be a bit controversial with the TOV here, but that there is also quite a big call in Germany to ask for these programs to specifically go beyond auditing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place for us to go to our third panelist. Our third panelist is Mr. Thorsten Metz from Initiative Global Solidarity, a new GIZ project. As a labour market economist, Thorsten has focused throughout his career on the link between private sector development and social and labour standards. He's worked in Indonesia, Thailand, Jordan, Myanmar and elsewhere, and he supported the agenda of decent jobs and engaging with the private sector in developing sustainable business and employment. Thorsten, you're leading a new GIZ project called Initiative Global Solidarity, IGS. Could you give us a brief overview of the project and with a focus on how you think the German requirements might affect Asia?
Thank you very much, Stephen, and also thanks to the organizers and the other panelists. It was already an exciting discussion, so I will perhaps try to keep it short on the descriptive part so we can continue with the actual pointers. So the project is as a matter of fact, is from the German government sponsored project from the so-called Ministry of Economic Development, and it's focusing on bridging the part from the German side, the European side, to really the suppliers in the countries and producers. So the discussion we have right here, right now, sponsored by the FABRIC team, is really part of what we are looking forward to engaging further and deepening in the near future. There will be 4 areas of activity. The first one is supporting shared responsibility models. I think we will discuss this and already just did. I really love the comment from Aaron. He exactly pointed at that part. Secondly, we will look into data collection and transparency, what can be done there from both angles. Thirdly, we will establish so-called help desk in, for now, 3 countries to support producers on the subject through information, linking with supporting mechanisms, but also advising on risk mitigation and similar. And fourthly, also the topic of complaint grievance mechanisms will be addressed because this is part of the German law as for now. But this is perhaps as a very brief overview.
Well, so you mentioned there the, shared responsibility between producers and brands. And this does go to the heart of really what Aaron was getting at. Can you just expand a bit, more on this shared responsibility and how do you see the project playing out and benefiting both sides? Frank can see difficulties, Aaron can see difficulties. How does this project help perhaps with that?
Yeah, thanks. So already there were a number of good pointers. Also, Julia actually pointed really at really the perhaps most important aspect, which is collective bargaining, to our understanding. Shared responsibility in this context means for us that there's not just a responsibility that's meant to be implemented then by the producers or supplying companies, but actually also by the buying companies in this context. As a matter of fact, we shouldn't forget that the ones that are getting controlled by the German side is actually the buying companies. So they are the ones who have to provide the annual reports that are being checked and how measures are actually implemented. So they have an actual interest that things are running and working. And aside from, say, fulfilling a legal obligation, there's also from their, say, an overall obligation towards their products, they're also towards the civil society. So the movements that also Julia described since the past 15, 20 years is not just about really, say, a contractual agreement that's sort of kicking down the responsibility to implement, but it's actually a lot larger concept. And to our understanding, this is what we would feel like we would like to support in terms of shared responsibility, is really providing a platform or strengthening systems of collective bargaining, meaning that from both angles, we will help the dialogue. What are issues? What are the challenges really in implementing? How can costs be mitigated? But also looking into industry-wide agreements, looking into harmonization of standards, because at the moment there are multiple initiatives out there. You all are aware of those in the textile apparel industry, how these standards can be harmonized in that sense, what are the actual requirements, looking at larger frameworks, how these can be linked, and how can also self-assessment can take place, so that it's not always only like an external system that's looking at you or you're getting audited, but also that there's a means that allows you to check your own mechanisms, as well as also report towards perhaps an industry-wide standard. And the approaches in the textile industry is already quite far advanced. We are also looking in the electronic sector, and so far the observations are it's a bit different in that sector. So I feel there's already really an advantage looking upon all the existing initiatives in this sector, and I think this is what should be taken more and also pushed forward. I think your mic.
I think, thank you. I think you can see the question there from Fawad Usman. You know, he's asking, you know, we already, you know, our clients already require audits on human rights practices. What do we have to do beyond what we're already doing? Is there, you know, he's mentioned German companies such as KIK. What do you
So to my end, thank you. It's actually exactly the point. Yeah, so if you're already participating in a scheme of say, fulfilling your due diligence in terms of ecological and social responsibilities, you're very much likely covered. The German law really is looking into the basics of core labor standards. There are 6, like non-slavery, no child work, and similar aspects, which ultimately you will be covering already. And the ecological part, Frank nicely put together, is looking in particular into usage of chemicals, mercury, and similar, which are protocols which have been established a long time past. So if you're participating in any of these initiatives, you're very much likely already fulfilling all the requirements of the German due diligence law. So in that part, I think it's mostly just checking upon if there's a matching loophole, or talking to your buyer, your business partner in that sense, if there are additional requirements in terms of reporting coming at you, in terms of data collection, you may have to do to provide this data to them. But overall, in that case, you absolutely don't need to worry. I'm pretty sure you're largely covered.
I can echo this from our experience. One thing that we did look a bit closer at already a while back were grievances mechanisms, because the law does put a focus on this, both that we need to establish them within our own operations, but also asking for them within the supply chain. And because grievance mechanisms are best functional the closer they are, we also basically take a look now at the grievance mechanisms in the factories. And we didn't have that in our audit protocols before, and we changed that a little. And we also, I mean, we had that focus already before, and we see that is also one that you can read out of the law, is also the committee work and so on. That is also something where we have put a focus on, and where we feel that we, with this focus of the past, are pretty well prepared for the law. And then there's a question about, should I start answering that around the deeper supply chain below tier one? That's actually also the last point I think I had on my list, where I think that this could be an effect that that the supply chain feels that some big fashion brands, we are not the best ones at that, but some other ones have started looking into the deeper supply chains. So you might have already been needing to provide your pre-suppliers and so on. I do think that that will increase over the time, and I do very much share also the concern that we will go into with multiple auditing protocols again into the deeper supply chains. And I would also very much hope that we can there harmonize standards, and we would, for example, as Chibo, would be looking at what they already provide to not necessarily do everything on our own. But I share that concern. I do think that the deeper we go, the more complex does the supply chain get, but it also means that there are probably more people asking for the same thing. So it would be good to harmonize and look at what's already existing.
That's an interesting point, and I'll just pick up on Aaron's second part of Aaron's question there. You're talking about tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 audits, where brands have typically focused on tier 1 auditing. And then Aaron goes on to say, well, how are they going to cope with multiple requests from different global human rights due diligence laws from multiple countries? Now, last week, in part 1 of this seminar series on laws, we heard about duty of vigilance in France. Norway has a law. The Netherlands is looking into a law. We've now got the German law. Of course, coming up is the EU wide law, so on and so forth. Frank, I just wonder if we could come to you. How does TÜV Rheinland see this mushrooming or expanding human rights due diligence laws? Are we going to end up with the same kind of audit fatigue that suppliers have been highlighting for several decades now? You're on mute.
It's not a very easy question for us. It's very difficult to make sure that all these relevant regulations from the different countries will be implemented in the organizations. And we had to make sure that all our auditors will be informed about these regulations, which are relevant for the plans. And so we had to train our auditors a lot about these regulations. This is very important for us, and it will be for us a chance that there will be a regulation from the EU which is changing all the country-specific aspects into one aspect, and it could be a chance for us to make it much more easier for all of us. But I think it will take a long time that the EU will implement these regulations on one level. So
Thorsten,
for
what
next
about,
years? Yeah.
go on, Frank.
Okay, so for the next years, from our side, it will be the situation that we have to check: is the French law, is the German law implemented in the way that they are focused it, and so we are just waiting for the regulations of the EU. They will come, but
Yeah,
it
right.
will take time, of course.
Right. Thorsten, from the perspective of the Initiative Global Solidarity, how do you see this playing out?
Thanks. So this is indeed something we look upon, and also we understand the German law not as something particular special out there, because there's been laws already in effect since several years in other countries. We have the UK Modern Slavery Act. In Australia we have a similar act. We have the French Duty of Vigilance law. We have the California Act of Modern Slavery, and similar and so on. So there is really say a handful of laws already implemented in the German law, only echoes some of these aspects really there. And the requirements, if you look at them specifically, are also quite similar, frankly. They all revolve around key aspects of labor standards. And this is something, as we pointed out earlier already, they make really the core of all the laws. Yeah, this is something that's really not particularly unique to the German law, any other. It's really what this is all about. And the second part, this I think maybe even the more interesting part in the near future to look upon, is environmental requirements. As we know, this is a topic on the agenda worldwide by now, and at the moment the requirements are fairly modest, say in the expectation level, and quite specific, but this may expand at some point in the near future. The EU provides definitely an option to streamline regulations, and once it's in place, of course, the German, Norwegian, French law, I'm sorry, have to be modified accordingly to echo really the new directive from the EU. So there will be an automatic streamlining taking place. However, in terms of requirements and the focus, it will, to my understanding, not adjust significantly. So looking upon these core aspects at this point in time is probably the one thing to do, and see how this is followed up in your own business.
Thanks, Thorsten. Yeah, these are thorny questions, certainly. All right, I'm getting bombarded, or we're getting bombarded by questions in the chat box now. So I'm just going to start going through these, and whoever thinks they should jump in or wants to jump in, please do so. Some of them might be directed more to Frank, but please feel free to say whatever you want to say. So I've got a question here. To my understanding, there is no legal requirement to document due diligence with indirect suppliers. There is only a requirement to react on substantiated knowledge or claims. Is that correct? Then this, of course, does not release brands from ethical requirements, but is that statement correct?
This is correct, yeah.
Okay. We can move on to the next one.
That's
correct. Do you need to say anything more about that, Frank, or is that?
So it's okay. So you can read in the law, yeah. And so you can find these explanations in the law, and the question is, what will you do if you will have a supplier and you will find information about the supplier in the internet, or you get some information? What will you do in your company if you are not having a system which says, okay, we will do that or that, and we will have corrective actions to implement other activities in the companies? And you have to know which suppliers were in your supply chain. Otherwise, you have no chance to react. From where will you know that this supplier has a problem? From where will you know that? If you don't know that this company is in your supply chain. So it's very difficult.
Okay.
Maybe
Manuel Pajani asks, and this I think was motivated by something that Julia said about grievance mechanisms. Emmanuel asks, how do you ensure the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms in factories? Your own solution, trade unions, NGOs, you know, how do you ensure the effectiveness of this grievance mechanism that the law now requires?
I mean, the law so far doesn't give guideline on this in particular, but I do think, I mean, there is a lot of guideline out there from the OECD and so on how effective grievance mechanisms look at, and that's also referenced. So there, in a way, the German law doesn't require something special, but builds very much on what has already been developed. From our point of view, and that's also how we have set up our own grievance mechanism, particularly in textiles, and there I have to admit we're further than in some of our other business areas where we also don't have effective grievance mechanisms yet established, builds on a multi-layer. And I do think that that's also something in a way that makes it that makes sense, because accessibility is a very important point about grievance mechanisms. So are people aware and feel comfortable of actually handing in grievances? And the closer this is to them, the more accessible it is. So I see it multi-layer, that it is required within factories, and knowing about, you know, the countries that GIZ FABRIC is active, most of you have actually your own national legal requirements on this also, where some kind of complaints committees or some kind of worker participation committees, and I know that it's quite particular in every country, but is required. So for us, that's the first entry point at factory level. We know that a lot of times, while they're legally required within the countries, they do not exist or they do not function. And for this for us, this is a first entry point with the factory of saying they're legally required in your countries. We work with you together to making them effective and making them accessible, and to also creating the trust within the factory that they are used. However, I do think that an effective system has a layer above it. And this is where I want to very much appeal again to industry-wide solutions. And I do think that it makes very much sense for the producers here to take that on your national level and to set up national grievance mechanisms where you need to ensure that they are independent. And then working with trade unions and NGOs is a good way of also making sure that this is accessible and that it's independent. And while there might be some people that see the court critical in this audience, I do think that the court is a very good case of where a really good grievance mechanism has been built up on a national scale on health and safety. And we, for example, in ACT have also started to set up dispute resolution mechanisms in Bangladesh and Cambodia, or in Myanmar, which is now not so relevant anymore. But anyways, where it's also about brands working already jointly with producers and where we have the unions on board. And we, for example, as Chibo, we have a global framework agreement with Industrial. So there's also a grievance mechanism in it. And we see that that's the most used one. So the most grievance cases as my team handles come from Industrial affiliates who tell us about violations in our factories that then we take back to the factories and solve together with the factory and the local affiliate.
Thanks, Julia. We've got two more. We've got two questions here. I'll start off with Mr. Chowdhury. If I am a supplying factory, tier one, right? So I'm a tier one factory, then does this law cascade down to my suppliers of, for example, raw materials, fabric, accessories, etc.? Do our suppliers need to audit their own suppliers too? Anyone?
Should I go again? I mean, it goes back to the question that we had a little bit before. Legally, strictly speaking, we have this German legal term of substantiierte Erkenntnisse, which is still also legally debated in Germany of how far that goes. But at the moment, it says that the buyer or the retailer is only to take action if there is substantive knowledge. I don't know if that's a proper legal translation. I'm not familiar with English legal terms, sorry. What that exactly means will be determined also further on in the process. And there might also be a bit of a gray zone legally speaking. I do think that also retailers and buyers, like they have in the past, will take slightly different approaches to them. Some might be more proactive in making sure that they know their supply chain beyond tier 1 to be able to, like Frank Herfs have, to react in case there is then knowledge about violations and to proactively engage. I think how they will do that will depend on the brand. What I can say from our experience is that we see that it's already difficult for us, and I hear that from others also, to even build up that level of traceability. And so what we see is that when we ask our tier 1 factories, who do you work with? That changes a lot, and that there is a whole network behind them, which makes it difficult for them to do something in their supply chain and for us. So we are starting to work with our tier 1 factories, or we're starting to ask them, and I think there are brands that are actually more advanced than we are on this topic, to also streamline and concentrate their own supply chains. So in a way, it's what Chibo has done about 15, 12 years ago, where we had a lot more textile and garment factories, and where we concentrated to a list that's today public between 200 and 300. So a good way for you as a producer to be prepared of that is to know your own supply chain and to also look at where can you concentrate. And to look and possibly also building up more committed relationships. I do think that this will be, and if we look at what's coming on EU level, where this might, the responsibility of brands will go even further, this might be a good way to handle this. Looking at who then will be responsible for auditing, I think that also depends a little bit on the particular relationship. I can say from our side, we basically at the moment have the same policy as with our tier 1 factories. If we audit tier 2 or tier 3, we cover the cost of the first audit, not of the follow-up audit. So there we apply the same rules as with our tier 1, but that will depend on the brand.
Okay, thanks, Julia. All right, we're just about out of time for our discussion here, but I'll just push it a little bit further. We've got a couple of questions left. One of them takes up this issue of substantiated knowledge. This German term, substantiated. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. This substantiated knowledge. I googled it quickly just to translate it. I don't know what would be actually an English legal expression, but Mark asks, how do we interpret this as paragraph 9 of the law, which with regards to cotton production in China? Now, I don't want to get into a discussion about cotton in China, but what would that mean for a fashion company using cotton from China? Needs to deal explicitly with HR issues, human rights issues in the cotton fields in China, and how is this company expected to mitigate and human rights abuses or issues that have their root cause at the national level? I don't know if that question's answerable, but it does. I just quickly put that out there because Julia, you were mentioning this. How far does this take us, and perhaps where does it end, or what happens with that? The very last question. I want to be a moderator that can say that I did get to all the questions. The final one is, back to grievance mechanisms. They are a requirement, but aren't necessarily function. Isn't this changing the power dynamic by essentially saying laws aren't working, so here's some things brands say that you need to do? Is that looking at changing the rule of law in supplier countries and using European power to replace local laws? Where does that cease? Does anyone, Thorsten, do you want to have a shot at that, or is that outside your remit?
Why I'm laughing, thanks, Steve. This is indeed a discussion we also have within our, say, set of stakeholders, and how far actually this is a push to overcome also political bargaining systems. So if not, these issues shouldn't be bargained on a political level rather than, say, on a business level. And there's possibly some truth that there is an underlining effect, perhaps. However, since there are no real leverages, of course, a European or lawgiver has on other countries' laws, it can only govern its own, say, corporations and its citizens. And so far, there is not really the interest to change or replace laws on other countries' local level, but to ensure the realm they are governing. That this may affect, to a certain extent, business relations or how business is done, how things are sourced. The cotton is a great example, even though it's a thorny one, but you will find it in other raw material issues, really, also in, as I mentioned before, in electronics, how lithium or other raw materials are sourced. This is really looking into rather business relationships and how far this can be supported in that, to be a bit more in the line of social and ecological standards. It may have an impact, but of course there's no interest at this point that local laws are affected. This is still the realm of the other countries.
Thanks, Thorsten. I thought I was going to be able to be a moderator who got every question done, but Zishan from Gohar Textile has slipped one in very late. Zihan, I'm sorry, we're well past our time limit here. I'm already pushing to the very edges of the envelope. But what I think, what Zishan's question does get at is that there is an appetite for discussing this. Julia mentioned that at Chibo they've had quite a lot of discussions in Europe about this, but this is the first time she's had the opportunity to discuss these sorts of things in Asia with Asian producers. And I think the appetite for this kind of discussion is quite high in the region. So maybe this is something that GIZ needs to come back to. Thanks for the great questions. There's nothing very easy here for anybody, and I guess this is where Thorsten's project can hopefully start delivering some solutions around the shared responsibility, the initiative Global Solidarity. I really appreciate him coming along and telling us a bit about that as well. To all of the three panelists, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and I'd like all the attendees who've been listening in to join me in thanking them with some virtual applause. Thank you. I would like to remind you, just before I hand back to Lisa for some final comments and observations, to fill in the survey. The survey link will go into the chat box now. And I'm saying that very deliberately because I'm hoping someone's listening to me and putting the link into the chat box now. And so please take the time to click on that link and feed back to us in our survey how we can do things better, how we can improve, how we can make these sort of things more effective for people. So over to you, Lisa, for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks so much. To me, it was really great to see all of the interest here today and see that we got so many questions in the chat. And I think it was also nice to see that there were a few suggestions for follow-up online seminars, such as purchasing practices, looking into other laws that are coming our way, and for example, the Bangladesh Accord, as we plan to do next week. So I think that was really great to see and a good start to the rest of the seminar series. So if you have further topic suggestions, please mention them in feedback form. If we look at today's topic, I think if we quickly summarize that, what's really important about the German law is that primarily it's going to affect German companies and therefore the clients of this region that have more than 3,000 employees, and then later move to just 1,000. So the scope will be expanding. If we look at German companies, that means a company that pays taxes in Germany. So this may also cover subsidiaries. Again, quite a broad scope. This also covers direct suppliers and then for some areas, indirect suppliers, which was something that Frank highlighted in his presentation. And this may include complaint procedures, effective review of measures, or internal documents and transparency efforts. The other point is that it doesn't just cover human rights, but also environmental rights, although maybe to a different extent. And the risks that are under human rights and environmental may differ per company and per country, which was also something I think Frank gave the example of Pakistan. So what's really new here is that the brands will look into systems they need to see established. So it's not so much on a case-to-case basis, but really systems that look into human rights and environmental risks. And they need to be in place and running, and this needs to be shown and very visible, both from producer side and also from the brands. Chibo then mentioned that the reason why they've welcomed this law is that compliance shouldn't be a competitive disadvantage, and there needs to be a certain minimum threshold if the advances in reducing human rights and environmental risk really are to be achieved. So the law doesn't require zero compliance issues, but it does require systems and remedial measures to best prevent them. And the law also goes further now as it invites more conversation about multiple departments such as compliance, legal, and purchasing practices. And those cannot be met on an individual level, but they need the approach that now needs to go through the industry, through the sector, is most likely best met through industry-wide initiatives rather than sort of tick-the-box approaches that were often practiced earlier. And the law also moves beyond certain industries. As Thorsten was saying, the law also covers other industries as well. And then one of the risks of the laws is that responsibilities get pushed to suppliers. With any new initiative and any new effort, you can always need to remedy new risks that arise of that, so there are no unintended consequences. One is, and many of our audiences have asked that question, getting pushed down the supply chain. Second risk is who will pay for this. So if this is a cross-industry requirement, does this get paid by brands, by the suppliers, who covers auditing costs, and how does this risk management get pushed towards tier 2, 3, and potentially even further? In order to reduce this risk, there are plenty of calls for standardization, and one other call of reducing the risks of making this very unmanageable, the further down it goes in the supply chain, is having more stable relations with your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers and subcontractors. If we then look into the expected outcome of the law and move away from potential risks that it does entail as well, the law asks for very specific results, but it doesn't necessarily show one way of doing it. So the question came up of, Does the law prefer third-party auditing or in-house auditing? As long as this shows compliance and there's a system for compliance in place, it doesn't favor either one of those approaches. And then in order to now bring those two sides together and bridge the implementation gap between the legal obligations that come from Europe and Germany in particular, and move away from just contractual agreements towards shared responsibility models, projects like the Initiative for Global Solidarity and also brands are pushing for these models and are showing best practices. And this again goes towards ideally industry-wide approaches and moving from external supervision such as audits to including all stakeholders in the dialogue. However, while this all may sound like there's a lot of additional requirements coming the way, it also needs to be highlighted that many of the producers already fulfill a large number of the existing standards, particularly those who are already engaging in specific initiatives. So it may just be a point of reporting on it better, providing better data collection, but this will be something that will need to be specifically looked at for Tier 2 and 3. If we look into the outlook of the German due diligence law, the hope is that the German law, as well as other laws within Europe, are being harmonized and hopefully streamlined through the European law, and that this may also take on environmental requirements a little bit more than the law does at the moment. But what I think we can already tell with this outlook is that the topic is going to stay with us for a very long time, and that there is lots of room for both controversy and also models of shared responsibility, and ideally more engagement and stakeholder dialogue on eye level. So we are hoping that we can contribute to that through the online seminar series. So again, if there are specific issues that you would like to see picked up here or that you feel are much needed in the regional dialogue, please let us know in the feedback form, and we'll hopefully see one of those areas picked up next week in our online seminar on the Bangladesh Accord as just one example of industry-wide approaches. Thanks to you. Maybe I hand over back to you, Stephen. I landed on the dot at 5:30 here in Cambodia.
Thanks, Lisa. It's 6:30 here where I am. Thanks for mentioning again the webinar, the online seminar next week. I'm just putting the mail into the chat box again. If you're a producer in the Asian region and you have questions on the international accord, send them to that address. Your name will not be used, and we'll use your questions to start off the session next week on the international accord. That's it. On behalf of GIZ FABRIC, I would like to thank you all for dialing in and for staying with us. We value your support. Thank you very much. And thanks once again, of course, to our panelists. Really engaging discussion. I enjoyed it immensely, and without whom this would not have been possible. We thank you all very much for your valuable time. That's all from me until next week. Take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.